Hello, I'm having the honor to present this presentation at the scientific sessions of the American Heart Association in Chicago. The presentation is entitled "The Worldwide Impact of COVID-19 on Clinical Care and Quality of Life in the ACHD Population." Let's go back to early 2020. The SARS-CoV-2 virus was spreading around the world, and this had far-reaching consequences. This is how cities around the world looked like. They were completely empty. However, in the healthcare system, these were the pictures. But also for non-COVID related care, there was a huge impact. All elective procedures were postponed or were cancelled, and in-person visits were replaced by video visits. And this is exactly what was happening in the care for adults with congenital heart disease. Elective procedures, operations, cardiac catheterizations were postponed for a later date, and all the the follow-up visits were replaced by video visits. Of course, the pandemic had a huge effect on virtually all aspects of our life, be it employment, financing, social life, and so on. And the same was true for people with congenital heart disease. And in the very beginning, the first wave of the pandemic, there was a lot of stress, a lot of uncertainties. People didn't know what to expect. And it was in this very first wave that in different patient populations, the impact of the pandemic has been studied. And these are data from such studies that were conducted in congenital heart disease. For instance, the first study was a study mainly conducted in US patients, and they found that 42% of the patients had clinically significant stress. That was a US population. A second study was conducted in Greece. There, the researchers found that 75% reported a moderate to severe impact of the pandemic on their mood. Once again, this was in the heat of the moment. This was in the first wave of the pandemic, and it's understandable. Everyone was indeed stressed and uncertain about what the future would look like. The question is, of course, was this impact long-lasting? Do we still see an impact of this phenomenon? And that is particularly something that we studied with an international consortium where we looked at the impact of the pandemic on patient-reported outcomes such as quality of life, such as depression and anxiety in adults with congenital heart disease. And the results of this study were published in this paper. This is a sub-study, or a preparatory study, I should say, of the Approach-IS project. Approach-IS is a study that is looking at patient-reported outcomes and experiences in adults with congenital heart disease from all over the world. Overall, 53 centers coming from 32 countries participated in this study. And we started up with this study late 2019. And when the pandemic started, there were 3 centers that had finished their data collection. And this was a center in Belgium, in Norway, and in South Korea. And once that the pandemic started, and once that we encountered the first data on the impact of the pandemic on stress and depression and so on, we started to think that it would be worthwhile to do a direct comparison of the pre-pandemic situation in those patients we collected data on beforehand, and compare that with the peri-pandemic situation. And the interesting fact that we were having 3 countries in this was that we could compare 3 countries with a different evolution and a different course of the pandemic. And as you can see here, in Belgium, there was a high impact on the incidence of infections and on mortality, much more than compared to Norway or South Korea. When we asked the patients what domains were affected by the pandemic, they indicated that to a large extent the social life was negatively impacted by the pandemic, followed by mental health, professional life, physical health and family life. Financial situation and spiritual life was not affected at all. The interesting thing was also to see that there were some domains that were positively affected. For instance, the family life, there were quite some patients that indicated that the family life was strongly affected in a positive way during the pandemic. When we asked patients how they felt about the pandemic, then the majority indicated indeed that the coronavirus and the pandemic made them feeling worried, made them feel afraid. It felt close to them because they saw people in their surroundings that were infected by the virus and they felt stressed. However, the majority of the patients also indicated that they did not feel isolated, lonely, depressed or helpless. When we compared the patient-reported outcomes before the pandemic with the status during the pandemic, we could calculate the effect sizes. What we observed was that the effect sizes were consistently below the level of 0.2, which means that the difference between pre and peri-pandemic is smaller than small, and therefore we can conclude that the pandemic as such did have a negligible impact on patient-reported outcomes in our patients. These findings were to a certain extent confirmed by another study, a study that was conducted in the Netherlands looking at psychopathology. The investigators looked at the relationship between psychopathology and the COVID stringency index. And this is an index that indicates how strict the measures regarding the COVID pandemic were in that particular region. And indeed, they found that there was no relationship between psychopathology and the COVID stringency index in the Netherlands. Let me come to the conclusion of this presentation. My take-home message for you is, although the COVID-19 pandemic has been disruptive in many ways, the pre to peri-pandemic changes in PROMs, patient-reported outcomes, and patient-reported experiences of adults with congenital heart disease were negligibly small. Thank you for your attention.